So, where should I even start? Christian Atsu has passed away in the most tragic of circumstances. It's easy to sometimes see footballers as these higher, invulnerable beings, but just 2 weeks ago, on the 6th of February, a massive earthquake hit Turkey and Syria, and the headquarters of Atayaspor collapsed. Atsu was first assumed to have been in there, but then, among all of the chaos, someone messed up and the news came out that he had been rescued with just an injury to his foot and difficulty breathing. His children, his wife, saw those news and for a second there, they believed he was fine. But in fact, the news were simply wrong. He wasn't even at the club's headquarters at the time of the tragedy. Instead, he had been playing poker at a friend's house and upon further investigation, his agent ended up coming to the conclusion that he had arrived at his 9th floor apartment just 20 minutes before it all began. A couple of red lights, maybe a bit of traffic, and he would have been fine. But unfortunately, it happened, and 8 days after the earthquake, on Valentine's Day, his wife was informed his shoes had been found among the rubble. 4 days later, his body was found as well. After getting the news, I felt his story should be told. I asked some of you and everyone seemed on board, but honestly, I never expected it to be so unique. His story is far more than just another tragedy. There's a lot to learn from it, and there's no need to embellish it. Atsu really was a special guy. I used to look at his career as the story of a massive disappointment. I mean, when the guy arrived here at Porto, there were literally people referring to him as the African Messi. And still, as time went on, things only seemed to get worse for him. But now, reading about him, I've realized that Atsu was a good person first and only then a good footballer. He enjoyed his life, he always put his family first, and now, looking back at all of it, it just makes a lot of sense that he valued what he had so much. Because to start with, he had nothing. He was born alongside a twin sister in a family with 10 kids who lived in an uncompleted building, so crowded that Atsu himself had to sleep in the bathroom. But Atsu was born in the same month that Ghana lost the final of the 1992 African Cup of Nations, and for some reason that stuck with him. He dreamed of one day bringing back the glories people had been waiting for so long. However, for a long time, things only seemed to get more difficult for him. Once he finally found a football team, their pitch was so far from his home, he had to make a choice. He either spent the money his mom gave him for food on a train ticket, or he jogged all the way there, meaning every time he played, he was either exhausted or hungry, and at around that same time, he was even forced to drop out of school so he could work, selling rubber bags on the street to help out the family, which depressed him immensely, to the point he would just disappear and be away from home for weeks at a time, sleeping wherever he could, in his own words, just trying to forget things. Finally, at just 13 years of age, he managed to shine through the adversities and get a 6-month trial at one of Feyenoord's satellite clubs, having to leave his family again, moving into their academy 3 hours away from home. Regardless, it should have been a great time, but instead, it was there that he received the worst phone call of his life, informing him that his father had gotten really sick. Atsu couldn't really afford to go back to see him, so he made his choice, hoped for the best and decided to wait until the trial ended to go back home. Unfortunately, he ended up never seeing his father again. By the time he got to see his family, it would be at his dad's funeral. To make matters worse, his family would not even be able to tell him why he died. No one knew. There wasn't enough money to send him to a doctor while he was alive, so there was no diagnosis, and there certainly wasn't enough money for an autopsy. Maybe it was because he never got to say goodbye, but for some reason that huge question mark seemed to affect Atsu more than his siblings, and it led him to make a decision that would change his life forever. As he said, "It inspired me. I was either going to be a doctor to help other sick people like him, or I was going to make it as a footballer to make sure no one in my family would ever have to go through that again." And so, he went back to the academy, but before that, a random stranger gifted him with a pair of football boots, simply because he saw him play and felt happy that a boy from his hometown had a shot at making it as a footballer. That was it, and according to Atsu, it was thanks to how special he felt wearing those boots that he managed to play well enough to convince the club to sign him for good. And it was from that moment onwards that everything began moving at the speed of light, all thanks to the kindness of a stranger. At the academy, Atsu stuck out, and soon a scout from FC Porto saw him and invited him over for a trial in Portugal. The moment he arrived there, one of the coaches took him for a tour of the stadium, and the moment he saw the pitch, he told them, "One day, I'll play here." Just 3 days later, they had signed him, and over the next 2 years, Atsu helped them win every youth competition they played in, all culminating in the 2011 FIFA Youth Cup, a competition that hadn't been won by a Portuguese team in 15 years. Before the year had even ended, Atsu had been promoted to the first team, sent on loan to Rio Ave, and awarded a Golden Dragon, the club's award for its most outstanding athletes. At Rio Ave, Atsu quickly became one of the team's key players, being involved in 12 goals over the season, the second highest in the squad, which was essential in their battle against relegation, which they narrowly won. These great performances led the man now known as the African Messi to be called back to Porto and called up to the Ghana national team, even scoring on his debut for the Black Stars. But here's where things began to go wrong for Atsu again. Finally playing for Porto, he was among stars like Hulk and James Rodriguez, and still he managed to stand out, which rightfully led a lot of big clubs to approach him. And it was at this point that Atsu went behind the club's back, meeting with representatives from Liverpool, knowing he had only a bit more than a year left in his contract, which could have allowed them to pressure Porto into selling for cheap. But instead, Porto played hardball regardless, leading to a bit of a mess, with Atsu getting upset that the club wouldn't let him leave and being punished by being demoted to their B team, with everything culminating in his departure to Chelsea instead for a fee higher than Liverpool had offered, though it still felt like a bargain. Regardless, Atsu felt like he had finally made it big time, so he stopped for a second and thought of everything that had allowed him to get there. Going back to Ghana and finding the man who had gifted him his first pair of boots, asking him how he could possibly pay him back, and his answer was nothing. A thank you is enough. Somehow making that story even more wholesome. However, once back in England, things didn't turn out so great at all. Mourinho didn't really have any intention of making Atsu part of his team. It was just another player Chelsea would loan out repeatedly in hopes that maybe one day, if he plays well, maybe he'll get a call back to the club. And to be fair, Atsu was exceptional that season. At Vitesse, he won the Player of the Year award, and at the World Cup, he literally started every single match, but all he got for that was another loan, joining Everton this time around and not even getting that much playing time there. It felt so unfair, but still, then, it got a million times worse. Remember when I mentioned it was his dream to bring the African Cup of Nations to his home country? Well, after that season, he got the chance to, and he excelled tremendously, instantly becoming the star of his team, even among the likes of the Ayew brothers and Asamoah Gyan, being the man of the match in both the quarters and semi-finals, even scoring the goal of the tournament in the process, and taking Ghana to the final once again. But unfortunately, the Ivory Coast beat them, and Atsu never got to live out his dream, instead having to apologize to his people as he felt they had given the trophy away. It was probably the hardest moment of his career, and it was made much worse when, despite the fact that he still managed to take the Player of the Tournament award, Chelsea somehow still didn't even give him a chance, sending him on loan again, this time to Bournemouth, where somehow a team that was literally on the verge of relegation thought they did not need Atsu, to the point he never got called up to a single league game, not even on the bench, being sent back from his loan in January, only to, you guessed it, get loaned again, this time around to Malaga, where things didn't exactly go well either. It was just depressing to see such a good player be treated like this, but thankfully, with his 5th loan in 4 years, Atsu arrived at Newcastle, where he would finally get to flourish. However, if you asked him, somehow he never regretted moving to Chelsea, saying that as much as playing on loan wasn't easy, no one could really predict what would have happened if he had stayed at Porto for longer, and that regardless of how much he may have suffered at times, in the end, it led him to Newcastle, where for a while his life was like a dream, and so, for that, it was all worth it. You see, Atsu had proposals to play in Spain and France, but his dream was always the Premier League, and so far, he had never been afforded a proper shot at making it there. So when the newly relegated Newcastle came for him, he didn't even think twice. It was his last chance at England. All he had to do was get them back to the Premier League and he could live the dream. And luckily for him, alongside him he had Benitez, who he absolutely loved, even referring to him as his football father. Atsu had finally found his home, and after a year of blood, sweat and tears, he had managed to help Newcastle back to the Premier League. Truthfully, Atsu never really managed to become a star at Newcastle, but one thing was sure. Over those 3 years with Benitez, he lived the dream. He enjoyed every minute he got on the pitch and made sure the fans would too. However, once Benitez left, so did the good times. After just 6 matches with Steve Bruce, the two ended up clashing following a 5-0 defeat to Leicester. Suddenly, after 5 consecutive starts, Atsu was only afforded more than half an hour of game time once across 3 whole months. When asked about why Steve Bruce dropped him, he said, "He gave me a reason, but I cannot tell you. One day, in the future, I will tell my full story." Unfortunately, now it may never come out. Following these problems, Atsu's career seemed to implode. First, he took a sabbatical from the national team, saying he needed to focus on his club career. Then Newcastle informed him he was not needed at the club anymore and should find another. But instead of accepting his fate, he instead informed them he would finish out his contract no matter what, as he quite simply did not want to force his kids to move to another country. 5 hours before the market closed, they even came to him with an offer to join Celtic, but as Atsu said, "They expected me to make a decision that would change my family's life in 5 hours?" People forget footballers are human beings. And so, in a last-ditch effort to show him that he really wasn't part of the team anymore, Newcastle sent him to play with the under-23s. Still, it did not work. Atsu stayed there for the entire season, and once that was done, he was a 29-year-old free agent who had not played a single match in over a year. Many thought he would retire. They saw him as someone who had hit rock bottom, but once more, if you asked him, he would say, "Why wouldn't I be happy? Where I came from, that was through hardship. This is nothing compared to that. It's true, when I came to Europe, I thought I would achieve more, but I cannot blame myself. There were simply too many factors at hand." Regardless, he eventually found himself in Saudi Arabia playing for Al Ghaid. It could have been great, one final run, some good money, you know how it goes. But unfortunately, he was hit with an hamstring injury and barely played for the club before he finally moved again, this time to Atayaspor, his final club. He was in the Turkish league, known for reviving careers. Everyone was already excited for him, and then, on just his 3rd appearance with Atayaspor drawn 0-0 with Kasimpasa, Atsu comes in with 8 minutes left and ends up scoring a stunning free kick 8 minutes into injury time to give them the win, sending the stadium into euphoria, making him feel like a kid once again. He probably hadn't felt so hopeful in a while. Maybe with a bit of luck he could finally return to the national team he loved so much, but unfortunately, at that moment, there were less than 24 hours before the earthquake hit, before he took his final breath. But now, knowing his story, I'm sure Atsu wouldn't have sat around contemplating ifs or buts. He would have looked back and remembered every moment he got to spend in the sun, every moment of glory, every one he was able to help through his endless work with multiple charities, every time he made one of his kids smile, every time he himself smiled, and he smiled a lot, and for that, I believe he would be grateful. He would believe it was all worth it. You see, there have been many goodbye messages posted, but the one posted by Danilo played with Atsu at Porto, I think it carries that message perfectly, so here it is. Moments considered normal can teach us great lessons. I remember it well. In our lunches and dinners at the hotel in Portugal, he would always eat a chicken, but then also the bone. That's right, the bone. We, in our superficiality, always laughed and said, "How are you so hungry, Atsu?" Until one day, despite not having to, and always lightheartedly with that big smile, you explained to us that you had the habit of also eating the bone because in your childhood you had learned not to waste any food that you had because you didn't know when or what would be your next meal. Damn, it felt like a punch in the stomach to hear that. Between us, once you asked me for my shirt saying, "When I'm a dad, I'll tell my kids that one day I played with Danilo." I just want to say you were an inspiration to me without even knowing, and now I'll be the one telling my kids that I played and met such a beautiful human being. Rest in peace, brother.